It's Saturday, March 12th, 2022, and today's episode is actually coverage from yesterday, Friday, March 11th. So as most of us end the work week and look forward to the weekend, here is a reminder to live within that happiness and feel its peace. I mean that sincerely. You need to enjoy it for those who can't. We're entering the third week of Russia's war against Ukraine. For Ukrainians, today is not really Saturday, and tomorrow is not really Sunday. Yesterday was a blur, today is chaos, and tomorrow is uncertain. Our previous episode was titled Truth, How to Appreciate It, Why It's Important to Spread It. And today's episode is Lies, How to Spot Them, How to Fight Them. We're entering a dangerous phase of Russia's war against Ukraine. As Russia fails to make quick work of their invasion, we're seeing more and more disinformation surface. It's coming from Russia, and it is quickly spreading to the far right, not only in the U.S., but in Europe as well. It's meant to sow doubt and confusion, to splinter the shared support we show for Ukraine. It's an assault on reality, waged by the same government that calls this war a liberation. We start today's show with a post from the Kiev Independent, written by Ukraine's former ambassador to Canada, Andrei Shevchenko. He currently serves with Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as an officer in the reserves. Quote, "To all our friends in the West, we know that you want to postpone a possible direct engagement, a direct war with the Russians. I'd like to be wrong, but I think it's quite obvious that the direction we are heading in is a direct war and direct action between Russia and NATO. So the sooner we start acting together, the sooner we close the skies over Ukraine, the more civilian lives we can save and the more chances we give to the peace process in general." End quote. A report released today by the United Nations puts the humanitarian toll on Ukraine in perspective. 2.5 million refugees have fled the nation since Russia began its assault. The war has displaced 1.85 million people inside the country. Those are people who have fled their homes for safer spaces inside the country. And 12.65 million people are currently stuck in the hardest hit areas of Ukraine. Ukraine has a total population of approximately 40 million. Most refugees have traveled west, with the majority, some 1.5 million, seeking refuge in Poland. Across the nation, 650,000 people are estimated to be without electricity, 130,000 without natural gas. Meriupol, one of the hardest hit cities, has been without water, electricity, and heat since March 1st. We have made it a point to mention this fact in most of our daily updates, and it bears repeating. Meriupol is a city of 400,000. Its civilian infrastructure has been mostly destroyed. Russian troops have been surrounding the area for over 2 weeks. After an unsuccessful meeting yesterday, March 10th, between Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, residents of Meriupol remain stuck in deteriorating conditions with no way out. The southern port city is locked in by Russian troops to the north, and Russian ships are in control of the Azov Sea to the south. Kuleba said of the meeting, quote, "I came here with a humanitarian purpose, to walk out of the meeting with a decision to arrange a humanitarian corridor to and from Meriupol." End quote. They could not come to such an agreement because Lavrov didn't have the authority to sign any agreements. The purpose of a ceasefire meeting with no permission to authorize a ceasefire is non-existent. There's no purpose. There's no reason to have one. To editorialize, the true purpose of these meetings appears to be farce. There is simply no other context in which to view it. A city of 400,000 without resources for survival, a ceasefire meeting that is predetermined to fail, leaves those citizens hostages in their own homes. This deteriorating humanitarian situation looks more like the Holodomor, Ukraine's Great Famine from 1932 to 1933, which resulted in an estimated 10 million Ukrainian deaths. Meriupol was the target of an airstrike just 2 days ago that resulted in the destruction of a maternity and children's hospital. It has since been reported that 3 children died as a result. They were found under the rubble of the building. Add to this the pointless suffering of nearly 3,000 newborns needing medicine, heat, food, water, and it appears the only function of such a meeting is to exacerbate misery. How anyone could report on this situation and not editorialize, I can't possibly understand. We are humans, looking at other humans. Kharkiv, another city we've been following closely, sits in the northeast Ukraine, 40 kilometers from Russia's border. It is Ukraine's second largest city. Like Meriupol, Kharkiv has been under constant assault for 2 weeks. Kharkiv Mayor Igor Terekov reports that 48 schools have been destroyed in the city by constant shelling. In a conversation with Boston, Massachusetts Mayor Michelle Wu, Terekov confirms that in spite of the endless shelling, he is running the city as best he can. Residential neighborhoods have been bombed. Over 400 homes are without power and water, but where the streets are clear, waste management trucks carry out their duties. Quote, "We are trying our best every day. We are supplying food. We are supplying medicines to those people. We're giving all the assistance like first aid, blankets, pillows to sleep. And also it's very difficult because we have a cold weather still. It's minus today, and we're suffering from this." End quote. In Izium, a suburb of Kharkiv, a psychiatric hospital was bombed by Russian forces. 30 staff and 330 patients were in the bomb shelter of the building when the attack came. They all survived. While slow, the Russian military has, as of today, encircled the city of Kharkiv, and the assault is expected to worsen. Another editorial, if you'll allow me. The mayor's comment about waste services still running may catch you off guard. It did me. Images from Kharkiv show a city nearly obliterated. Constitution Square, bridges, residential apartment buildings, buildings at Kharkiv National University, City Hall, the city council buildings, hospitals. They're all bombed out and burned. There are hundreds of photos online that show the true devastation. There are videos. There is evidence. But remember that this city is a large city. 1.4 million people call it home. And it covers a very large area. Russian shelling, while indiscriminate, is not universal. And this is true of all major cities, where in one part of a city there may be ruins, another may be untouched. The truly difficult part of understanding is that there is no order. There is no perfect picture. It is chaos, and it helps to check one's expectations at the door. News on Kherson, a place we haven't covered since it was overtaken by Russian forces over a week ago. Kherson is a port city in the south of Ukraine on the Dnipro River. Population 300,000. Last week, Russian troops entered the city's administration building, and today the building is guarded by Russian troops who are faced with regular protests. Last weekend, an estimated 2,000 Ukrainians protested in the city's Liberty Square. They wear the Ukrainian flag and stand face-to-face with Russian troops. They chant. Some are detained. Ukraine's High Military Command reports that 400 protesters have been detained by Russian troops. But that doesn't mean the Russian forces are firmly in control. They fire their rifles to disperse the crowds, but the crowds don't disperse. More protesters come. Russian troops have used their tanks as barricades to separate themselves from the protesters. The demonstrations in Kherson follow a rally staged by the Russian occupiers attempting to show that Ukrainians had welcomed the troops. A propaganda stunt, at the least. In the counter-protest, a man climbs aboard a Russian tank as it travels through a crowd. He stands on top of the tank, waving the Ukrainian flag as protesters cheer. Nothing says, "fuck you," quite like waving your country's flag on top of the enemy's war machine. Under occupation, the Ukrainian spirit won't be silenced. Another video taken by a protester shows Kherson residents shouting "fascists" at the Russian troops. In Meriupol, another southern city, protesters have shown a similar spirit. Earlier this month, March 2nd, video footage showed Ukrainian demonstrators blocking Russian vehicles as they attempted to enter the city. Protesters hold up their hands, some lay in the road. Meriupol came under Russian occupation early on in the invasion, before we even started making this podcast. February 26, 2022, only 2 days after Russia launched its invasion, Russian forces took the city of 150,000 and have been in control since. Protests make it clear Russian troops are not wanted there. In video taken Friday, March 11th, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced to fellow Ukrainians that the mayor of Meriupol, Ivan Fedorov, had been abducted. Video of the mayor being taken out of the city office building backs up the claim. Zelensky, quote, "They have transitioned into a new stage of terror in which they try to physically liquidate representatives of Ukraine's lawful local authorities," end quote. Witnesses to Fedorov's abduction state he had been taken away with a plastic bag on his head. The Ukrainian parliament made this statement on its Twitter account. This would be considered a war crime, one in a very long laundry list of war crimes committed by Russian troops. In a post on its website, the prosecutor's office of the Luhansk People's Republic, the Russian-backed separatist region in eastern Ukraine, said that Fedorov was wanted for, quote, terrorist activities and financing, quote, terrorist crimes against Donbass civilians. From the Ukrainian parliament Facebook page, quote, Russian troops who have been launching missile and bomb attacks on civilian facilities and infrastructure in Ukraine, including children's hospitals and schools over the course of 2 weeks, are cynically accusing the mayor of terrorism, end quote. While we would like to be wrong, while we hope we are wrong, and this is, editor's note, simply a prediction. It is nothing more than an educated guess. But How that staged trial turns out in the middle of war, well, we need only refer to history. If we are truly in hell, like we think we are, Unfuck the Poor predicts that we will see a public execution of the Ukrainian mayor. If we occupy less than hell, which we hope we do, we predict a lengthy imprisonment. Calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine have only increased as the week wore on. Our editorial report, Sitting Duck, made it clear that we believe a no-fly zone would be suicidal for all parties involved. However, the international community continues to make its case. Writing for the Kiev Independent, Francis O'Donnell writes, quote, "It has been repeatedly requested by its legitimate, democratically elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky, for the whole of this sovereign, independent, and democratic country, itself a founder member of the United Nations and the largest country entirely in Europe, in fact, at its geographic and now bleeding heart. Russia has no rights here. Its unprovoked and unjustified invasion was repudiated by the whole world in the UN General Assembly. Precedents for a no-fly zone exist, amply. The no-fly zone can be justified as discharging responsibility to protect, R2P, supported by the United Nations in 2005. It does not have to be NATO that enforces it officially, but a, quote, allied coalition, end quote, for Ukraine, including neutral countries, preferably under a UN mandate. Enforcing a no-fly zone and enacting R2P should sustain a ceasefire, which is essential. Humanitarian corridors should be more for delivery of aid and protection of civilians than their forcible evacuation, which only enables ethnic cleansing for which Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is notorious in other theaters of war." End quote. Since the Russian occupation of Meriupol, Russian troops have taken over Meriupol's radio and television towers and have been broadcasting Russian television stations to the city's captured residents. Meriupol's mayor, Ivan Fedorov, said in a public statement prior to his abduction that the Russian broadcast was spreading disinformation. And that leads me into the preachy bit of this episode, disinformation. On the world stage, the cult of QAnon, at this point an obviously Russian troll machine, has managed to amplify a new conspiracy theory about biolabs in Ukraine, and unsurprisingly, though Russia has been nearly cut off from the rest of the world, the Kremlin has announced that his new justification for invading Ukraine is its development and use of chemical or biological weapons from the very same exact places that the Q cult puts at the heart of the conspiracy. The conspiracy revolves around a false pretext for invasion with an ulterior motive, namely that Putin's claims of liberation denazification were intentionally false to hide the true motive, that Putin's real reason for invading Ukraine was to destroy biolabs installed by the United States. This conspiracy first emerged conveniently in the early hours of the Russian invasion, but this is not a silly, simple conspiracy theory. It is a prescription for heavier military force for widespread death. It is an outline of the destruction about to come to Ukraine. Destruction that has me doubting the possibility of a relatively quick and peaceful resolution to this war. So let's be depressed together. All of the death and destruction we're seeing, as it's broadcast in real time via Ukrainian citizens stuck as hostages in their own country, all of the atrocities of war, the bombing of children's hospitals, schools, residential buildings, leaving residents without food, water, and heat, the abduction of Meriupol's mayor, all of that is really, are you ready? All of that is really to protect the world. All of that brutalistic dispatch of humanity is to prevent Dr. Anthony Fauci, the American infectious disease expert, from manufacturing a new variant of the COVID-19 virus. Now, rational people would not believe that a false narrative around liberation meant to hide the more noble purpose of destroying biological weapons makes any sense. But we do not live in that world, unfortunately. For a full detailing of the origins of this conspiracy theory, please check out Justin Ling's full coverage of this on his Twitter feed, but I will help distill it to today. A note, the timeline for this conspiracy comes directly from Justin Ling's Twitter feed. However, I spent a considerable amount of time researching and backing up and verifying the claims that he's made. So let's go forward. Back in 2020, Russian press secretary Maria Zakharova said Moscow was paying attention to American labs abroad. A series of articles pushed by Stalker Zone, a pro-Russian news source, linked to those Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk. They published articles such as, quote, the Nazi origins of U.S. biolaboratories, and, quote, U.S. biological laboratory, how to catch the Pentagon red-handed. Before we go any further, we need to discuss the quadruple D threat of disinformation. Ben Ninmo, Information Defense Fellow for the Digital Forensic Research Labs, describes the 4 Ds of disinformation or propaganda as follows. 1. Dismiss. If you do not like what your critics say, insult them. 2. Distort. If you do not like the facts, twist them. 3. Distract. If you are accused of something, accuse someone else of the same thing. And 4. Dismay. If you don't like what someone else is planning, try to scare them off. Note that this is not a formula so much as a pattern. For something to be propaganda, it does not need to meet all 4 of these criteria. Rather, these are the 4 primary methods of disseminating or promoting or defending propaganda. On to the conspiracy theory proper. In the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, 2021, you remember when everyone was pointing fingers all around the world? The American public was blaming China and pangolins. Then they blamed Fauci and Bill Gates or something. China and Russia pointed the finger at the U.S. The U.S. pointed back. All 3 claimed that the other country's research in biological warfare could have been the origin point of the coronavirus. Now, just to put all of this into perspective, if you were to pay attention to conservative Twitter, this extremely deadly biological weapon manufactured in a military facility could be defeated by taking colloidal silver. Makes sense. So anyway, everyone was pointing the finger, and if you are accused of something, accuse someone else of the same thing. Distract. I'm not saying we needed to distract because we had something to hide, but to distract from the horrible job we were doing at controlling the virus. January 24th, 2022, a month to the day before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Bulgarian journalist Dilyana Gaitanjeva was publishing stories about biological experiments in Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia, for which she received an award. But I'm going to get to that at the end of this episode. Now, here's something important about Gaitanjeva, and it's totally not a conspiracy. While the rest of the world agreed, as in the UN and a bunch of its member nations, that Russia was behind the March 4th, 2018 poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia with the nerve agent Novichok, Gaitanjeva published articles claiming that they were using fentanyl. Russia agreed, but the rest of the world did not agree. In August of 2018, the U.S. concluded that indeed Russia was behind the poisoning and that Russian banks and exports would be sanctioned. Then, Trump decided not to do sanctions on Russia. Where were we? Oh yeah, biological weapons, like nerve agents and coronavirus and biolabs, right. So then a QAnon Twitter poster puts up a match of U.S. biological labs and a map of the Russian invasion a couple of weeks ago. You know about correlation and causation, right? Like if 2 things occur in the same time or place or have similar effects, they could either be caused by the same thing or they could correlate to something else entirely. So let's just start at a fact. Biological labs are a thing. The U.S. does them. They do them here at home by the thousands, and they do them in countries all over the world, all throughout their countries. Is that scary? If so, why? You go to the hospital, there are several biological labs there. When they take your blood, they send it to the biological lab for testing, to detect bad things in your blood. Did you go to school, like a high school, with a biological lab where you dissected a frog or cow eyeball? Now, I am not a smart man. I mean, I have my moments, but when it comes to science, I am not very smart. But my wife is. She has a PhD in molecular bioscience. She used to work in a biological lab studying colon cancer. Millions of scientists all over the world help grow our knowledge of science every day by going to their labs and performing the same boring experiments over and over so that eventually they might see something interesting under the microscope. Some labs have very dangerous things in them. Like my wife's old lab, it had smallpox in the sample fridge. No one wanted to throw it out. They might use it one day. Labs that study HIV and AIDS have, guess what? HIV in them. Some labs are dangerous. Some aren't. There are different levels of labs, but they are all biology labs or biological labs if you're looking to raise suspicions. Biolabs if you're looking to distort the information. So the 2 things about those maps that got posted to Twitter, the biology lab map and the Russian invasion map, I also don't know anything about war, but if I was going to do a war, I would probably want to take, large cities, probably. And if I was going to set up a biology lab, I would probably want to put them in a place with a lot of resources, a place that was easy to get to, like a large city. See, those 2 things, the presence of labs and the target of invasion, correlate to their location, large cities. The presence of a biology lab does not warrant a full-scale invasion of a country. Anyway, then this biolab conspiracy starts to pick up steam. The Russian embassy in Sarajevo claims the U.S. is filling Ukraine with biolabs. Hey, guess what? The U.S. has biolabs in China. Guess what else? American companies use biology labs in Russia to provide research data. It's almost like connecting all the world's scientists with global labs helps us accelerate the development of cancer treatments and vaccines. Can they also be used to develop dangerous weaponized biological material? Short answer, yes. Long answer, not really. All the dangerous weaponized biological material we have on hand, like all of it, is enough to wipe out the entire world population. We don't need to develop any. Bubonic plague, ricin, anthrax, Novichok, foot and mouth disease. That's the crazy part. What's a significant threat to humanity other than nuclear weapons and climate change? How about a targeted attack of bubonic plague? You know we don't have a vaccine for that, right? It's been around for centuries. No vaccine. And again, let me be clear. I'm not denying the existence of labs, specifically for the purpose of weaponizing biological material. Those exist. But there is a difference between developing new weapon agents and mass-producing existing ones. And none of this conspiracy theory has any evidence to suggest that any of these biological labs that they're talking about are doing either of those things. It's just conjecture. The labs exist. Some of them are funded in part by the United States, and that is literally all the information that they have. So let's build on the conspiracy. Fast forward to a week ago, March 3rd, 2022, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claims that the U.S., quote, built 2 biological war labs and they have been developing pathogens there in Kiev and Odessa, end quote. So the U.S. on March 8th clarifies this whole biolabs thing. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland says that yes, Ukraine has a biological research facility and that the U.S. is concerned Russian troops will get a hold of biological materials. Now let's play devil's advocate. That's like my favorite game. Let's say Nuland is not a credible source of information and is trying to hide in plain sight. Well, the threat now is that because these secret bioweapons being developed are a target for Russian soldiers, the threat now is that the U.S. is trying to hide them? Really? We're going to focus on that? We can put a pin in it and come back to it, after this whole war thing is over, but so far, no one has released any biological weapons anywhere. Zero. All those bombed buildings, the dead Ukrainian men, women, and children, and even the dead Russian soldiers killed by Ukrainians, none of them have died from chemical weapons. Are we now to believe that a deadly invasion of an entire nation is justified by the presence of weapons that haven't been used? What even is the fucking point of this conspiracy? Are the Americans pushing it on Twitter, those useful idiots that are not in on the conspiracy proper? Are they really asking to take the blame for everything that Russia has done? Because we're hiding biological weapons in Ukraine because we invented coronavirus? Where does this line of thought even take us? Well, we now have a full-fledged propaganda campaign. Need a justification for war? Call the opposition Nazis. Dismiss. Your liberation and denazification claims are becoming untenable? Claim you're really targeting biowarfare labs and target biological research facilities that are known to exist in major cities. Distort. The U.S. has intelligence suggesting you're likely to use chemical weapons? Claim they're the ones who are going to use chemical weapons. Distract. Worried that the world isn't going to remain bystanders for long? Just threaten all-out war and remind them that you have nukes. Dismay. And then, like his Nazi problem, Putin has a chemical weapons problem too. 2003, Yuri Shakotkin, investigative journalist, was poisoned and suffered a severe allergic reaction. He died days before he was planning to meet with FBI investigators in the United States. He had been reporting on the Three Whales corruption scandal, which documented the criminal activities of Russian Federal Security Service officers related to money laundering through the Bank of New York. 2004, Anna Politkovskaya, investigative journalist, felt sick and then fainted after drinking tea. Then, 2 years later, was shot in her Moscow apartment. She was notoriously against Putin's Russia and regularly published articles containing information gained from confidential sources in Putin's inner circle. 5 men were eventually arrested for her murder, but the investigation into who paid them or wanted her dead never took off. 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a Russian spy and vocal opponent of Putin, was poisoned by tea laced with polonium. In 2015 and 2017, Vladimir Kara-Murza, he was an opposition activist and journalist. He was poisoned twice. The first attempt resulted in kidney failure in 2015, and the second in 2017 resulted in a medically induced coma and eventually his death. 2018, Pyotr Versilov. He was a Pussy Riot activist and Media Zone publisher. He lost his sight, hearing, and mobility. He was then airlifted to Germany where doctors said his symptoms indicated poisoning. 2018, Sergei and Yulia Skripal. We already covered them. They were poisoned with Novichok. They both survived and have assumed new identities. 2020, Alexei Navalny fell into a coma after ingesting poison put in his tea. When he returned to Russia after his hospitalization, he was arrested. And that brings me back to Dilyana Gatenjeva. We're going to go down our own rabbit hole based on her reporting, and I did this all for you, the listener. I love you. Gatenjeva's propaganda reporting is based solely on distortion. Find a true thing, then twist it to make it whatever you want. In her January 24, 2022 report, Documents Expose U.S. Biological Experiments on Allied Soldiers in Ukraine and Georgia, she makes the very specific claim in her title that the U.S. is experimenting on soldiers. Gatenjeva's reporting and research is in-depth, but not really. It's also poorly done. We start with the basis of the report. 1,000 military recruits are going to have their blood drawn, which will then be tested for antibodies against 14 pathogens, including Bacillus anthracis, Brucella, and hantavirus. The project reporting guidelines raised red flags for the reporter. Quote, all volunteer deaths will be promptly reported, usually within 48 hours of the principal investigator being notified, end quote. When doing science and studying samples taken from living things, it is indeed important to report a subject's death for any reason as part of standardized reporting. If a subject dies for any reason, heart attack, stroke, car accident, that needs to be written down, and the principal investigator needs to be notified. If you want more blood samples, you may have to reduce your sample size or get a new subject. In an unrelated note, but in the same conspiratorial tone, so I will also chase this, she makes a claim linking the Lugar Center, where the research is being done, and the U.S. drug manufacturer Gilead, whose hepatitis C clinical trials saw 248 patients die. That's out of a clinical trial size of 8,000 patients. A thing about drug trials, they are usually done with seriously ill patients, and patients always die. That prescription drug you're taking now, someone died while they were taking it during a trial. Did the drug kill them? Probably not, but it does happen. Is the lab where the drug produced somehow responsible for the death of patients during drug trials? No. I'm on a drug that has a very rare rash and sudden death side effect. And guess how they figured that out? Clinical trials. A mother sued the University of Minnesota over it for a different side effect. Later in the reporting, Gatenjeva posts pictures of several cars in the Lugar parking lot that have U.S. diplomatic plates. Okay, I think that's just a red herring. Anyway, Gatenjeva goes back to the lab tests. Part of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, blood samples were to be collected from 4,400 healthy soldiers in Lviv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kiev, and were then to be tested for Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus and hantaviruses. So they are testing for a virus that originates in Eastern Europe and another that is found in rat feces. All right. Quote, there is no information as to what other procedures will be performed, end quote. Probably because it's just a blood sample. Gatenjeva provides a funding page that shows the DTRA has provided $80 million, quote, for biological research in Ukraine as of 30 July 2020. Tasked with the program is U.S. company Black & Veatch Special Projects Corporation, end quote. Now that sounds juicy. Black & Veatch is, wait for it, a design-build engineering firm. They have 1,200 employee reviews on Glassdoor.com. So, yeah, they probably got a big $80 million contract to design and build a laboratory. But saying they received $80 million to do biological research? Sorry, but this one was easily debunked in less than 5 minutes. Another company, CH2M Hill, received $22.8 million for the reconstruction and equipment provision for 2 more labs, a veterinary sanitary lab and a food safety and consumer protection lab. This isn't even news. The very last thing she cites as earth-shattering is the indemnification clause of the document she has, as in, if all the worst things in the world happen and they are my fault, you will not hold me liable no matter what. The indemnification clause, the kind of indemnification clause like standard cover-your-ass contract language. If you've ever read a big corporate contract, there's always the indemnification clause. And that's it. That's the bombshell report that says there are biological weapons labs in Ukraine. When Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on March 3rd that the U.S., quote, built 2 biological war labs in Kiev and Odessa, end quote, he's referring to the veterinary lab in Kiev and the food safety and consumer protection lab in Odessa. Consider it like this. How do you test a raccoon for rabies or a mouse for hantavirus? You don't take it to the hospital, you have to take it to a veterinary lab. Now, I love a good conspiracy theory as much as anyone, but they have to be good. I shouldn't be able to Google everything and get straight answers. I should be left confused and even a bit paranoid. But this biolabs thing, man, it really just bums me out. As propaganda, Gate and Java's reporting is, again, pure distortion. Take a true thing, misinterpret it, release it to the world. It's also a giant distraction. If you enjoyed listening to this conspiracy theory breakdown, let me ask you a question. How many refugees total have fled Ukraine as of today? And another question. How many schools have been destroyed by bombs in Kharkiv? I went over that earlier in this episode. The answer is 2.5 million refugees and 48 schools. The sole function of propaganda is to draw your attention away from whatever the real issue is. But when I go back to record this episode, I remember that today has been yet another day in hell for Ukrainians. As this conflict draws on, we are at an ever-increasing risk of disinformation completely derailing our attention, distracting us from what is real and confusing what is true and relevant. While we still have our sanity, I want to preserve this wholly untrue statement from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, quote, "We are not planning to attack other countries. We didn't attack Ukraine in the first place," end quote. Let this be our litmus test. As long as Lavrov's statement is undeniably false, then we have successfully weathered the disinformation machine. Should we come to believe this is a credible statement from Lavrov, I believe we will have lost ourselves entirely. This was coverage for March 11, 2022. Stay sane, support Ukraine. Visit helpingtoleave.org. Helping to Leave is a 100% volunteer effort that provides financial assistance for food, clothing, and medicines, and they coordinate logistics for refugees trying to leave Ukraine. We have an entire episode on them coming up soon.